Worlds 2022 has finally ended, and we enter now the off-season of League of Legends. For the LCS teams, that means another off-season of trying to figure out how exactly to be competitive on the international stage. It was another disappointing year for NA teams internationally. At MSI, Evil Geniuses only made the quarterfinals before being unceremoniously swept away by the eventual champion RNG. At Worlds, Evil Geniuses did manage to redeem themselves by beating Mad Lions and giving us a 3-0 victory over an LEC team in a best-of-5 for the first time ever. But that was the playing stage, and we all know what happened when the group stages finally began. LCS teams went a combined 0-9 in Week 1, and then in Week 2 each team managed to pick up only a single win, meaning that all NA teams finished in last place in their respective groups. At this point, it honestly seems kind of hopeless for our North American teams. We came to this year with a bunch of very strong and exciting young teams, which were crafted very differently, with Team Liquid being the super team, Cloud9 being the Korean molded team, TSM doubling down on Chinese imports, and Evil Geniuses going to the North American talent pool to promote two young, promising native talents. In the end, it's kind of fair to say that none of those strategies really worked other than Evil Geniuses. TSM was famously awful this year, with their young Chinese talent flaming out in spectacularly awful fashion. Team Liquid, of course, was easily the biggest failure in modern North American LCS history, not even qualifying for Worlds. And Cloud9, although they did end up making Worlds, jettisoned a lot of their Korean imports between the spring and summer splits, electing to reinvent that disappointing spring roster with some LCS veterans. Evil Geniuses, yes, they did manage to win the spring split finals and make it to Worlds, even though they didn't make the LCS finals in summer. And yes, Jojo Pyun has proven to be one of the rising stars in the LCS, but it wasn't entirely smooth sailing as their young promising ADC Danny took a step back during summer playoffs and did not participate in Worlds. The third representative, 100 Thieves, ran back basically the same roster that they had the last few years. Despite criticism from a lot of fans and observers that 100 Thieves are just a very safe team that doesn't have a lot of high-end potential, they proved that just being sort of above average is good enough to win in the LCS, making the finals in both spring and summer splits, but then proving the detractors right and flaming out in Worlds. So yeah, it's pretty depressing, and we're going into another offseason with LCS teams trying to figure out what exactly they need to do to finally be competitive internationally. And look, I'm no expert on Pro League of Legends, I'm just a guy who's been watching the scene for 10 years now. I don't have any big great ideas on how to improve the LCS internationally, but I do know somebody who might.
Why did it all turn out like this for me? I had so much promise. I was personable, I was bright. Oh, maybe not academically speaking, but it all became very clear to me sitting out there today that every decision I've ever made in my entire life has been wrong. My life is the complete opposite of everything I want it to be.
Well, here's your chance to try the opposite.
Yeah, I should do the opposite. I should.
If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right.
That's right, guys, I say we go full Costanza and we just do the exact opposite of what we've been doing for the last 5 years or so. Now, what exactly does that entail? Number one, stop paying top dollar for imports. I know that LCS in the past has been the region of we need to spend money if we're going to be competitive, but let's be quite clear, we have spent the money and we have not gotten any results. In fact, it might be fair to say that the results have gotten worse as we've spent more money. With so many teams seeming to be in financial straits right now, we need to kick the habit of just spending more money on better players and hoping that's going to deliver us the results, because as of now, it has not. So say goodbye to any thoughts of TSM Yankos or TL Reckless. If you want talent, we need to develop it either from within or from the small minor regions, which we have done with players like Jose Diodo, Broken Blade, Closer, FBI, and Fudge. They're less in demand, they're cheaper, and they're probably very hungry to get a shot in the LCS, rather than just showing up to get a paycheck. Number two is we need to reinvent the way that we think about coaching. I got mixed feelings on LS as a commentator and streamer, but I was really excited to see him come in as a coach of C9, if for nothing else because he sees the game very differently than a lot of NA coaches. His philosophy on training and scrim culture, how to practice, how to think about the game, is stuff that I really think more NA teams should have been more open to, and it was really disappointing to see him leave in such unceremonious fashion when we didn't really get a chance to see if his ideas could have taken hold. Now, yes, his protege Max Waldo did take over for him, and you can see a lot of the influences still on C9, but let's be honest, this is not the team and the philosophy that LS had come into the LCS with last year. By the end, Cloud9 had kind of devolved into just being another team that played the same sort of champions and the same sort of styles that a lot of other NA teams did, albeit with a lot of fun wrinkles. But I think a lot more teams need to follow that same approach and take a more different, radical thinking about how we practice and train and go through pick and ban. The most frustrating thing that I see every year on the international stage from LCS teams is that they try to play the game basically the same way that their opponents do. And yes, I get that there's a meta for a reason. There are just stronger picks. Certain items and objectives can just warp the game to make it most optimal to play in a certain way. But there's a great quote from Moneyball that I always go back to whenever I see teams trying to play the same champions, styles, and comps that the LCK, LPL, and even LEC teams do.
Is that there are rich teams and there are poor teams. Then there's 50 feet of crap. And then there's us. If we try to play like the Yankees in here, we will lose to the Yankees out there.
The LCK are the Yankees. The LPL are the Dodgers. Us, we're like the Milwaukee Brewers. We're a team that doesn't have a lot of resources in terms of top talent and top coaching. So we need to be thinking differently about how to get around this problem rather than just throwing more money at it and hoping to lure away enough players that eventually we will improve. So I think we need to find coaches, managers, and players who are willing to think outside the box, to play different picks, find pocket picks, find ways to counter the meta, find something different than just playing the same picks that the LCK teams are playing, only doing it worse, because right now that's what the LCS teams are doing. And you know what a side effect will be? That the LCS will be a unique region, which might actually give people a reason to watch it as opposed to just considering it a Fiesta version of the better regions. Number 3, stop overhauling your entire roster and expecting to be competitive. Some people might mock 100 Thieves for keeping their lineup the same for so many years, but I think there really is something to be said about having consistency in your coaching staff and your roster. Not only do the players build camaraderie, but players also learn each other's strengths and weaknesses, and that helps them to form a better understanding of what champions and comps they should and should not be playing. A big problem for LCS teams in the past is that they will overhaul 2, 3, or even 4 spots on their roster, putting together basically a brand new roster of people who haven't played together and expecting them to do well. TL and TSM this year were both perfect examples of that. Each of them only returned 2 players from their roster last year, and none of the players that they brought in had played together at all except for Tactical and Spica, who had played together in Academy. This means those teams needed time to develop synergy, learn each other's strengths and weaknesses to fully unlock their potential, which arguably they didn't get enough time to do last year, and since their rosters are going to be broken up, they're not going to get time to do so in 2023. In my opinion, if you have a roster you believe in, or you have players that you believe in as a core that can work together, you keep those 3 or 4 players together at all costs. Teams like Cloud9 with Fudge, Blabber, and Berserker, CLG with Palafox, Luger, and Poom, 100 Thieves with Closer, FBI, and Huhi, FlyQuest with the core of Philip, Takui, and Aframu, EG with Kenvi, Lost, and Ignar, and of course EG with Inspire, Jojo Pyun, and Vulcan. It is imperative that these cores be kept together at all costs by these teams, making tweaks around the edges just to see what kind of player can unlock this core's full potential. This is something that happens in sports all the time. Teams will keep their cores together for 2, 3, or 4 years, trying to see whether the problem is just that the core is not good enough, or if the pieces around it just aren't. If you have young players that can be around for the next 4 years and play at a high level, in my opinion, you keep them together at all costs. Don't do the thing like TL did last year, give up on the existing synergy when you had Santorin, Jensen, and Core JJ. Sure, you might be able to get better players in those positions, but just because you have better players doesn't mean they will work together better. And finally, we need to have the opposite expectations for our teams and ourselves internationally. I think right now we need to just accept a certain fact, which is that NA is the 4th of the 4 major regions. We are barely a major region in name only. So stop building teams with the expectation of going to Worlds and winning, or going on significantly deep runs. That is putting the cart way before the horse. What we need to be doing is building an infrastructure in North America, a culture where we can develop players and build the player base up to a point where eventually we can be on the same level as the LEC and the LCK. When you build these super teams like Team Liquid, or espouse that we have to be a Worlds team like TSM did, you're only setting yourself up for failure. Your goal should be to win LCS and then make Worlds. Anything after that is gravy. Until you have mastered that and you're making Worlds consistently like 100 Thieves have, only then are you allowed to raise your aspirations and try and build a team that could maybe make a run at Worlds. But your goal should not be even to be competitive or get out of group. It should be to fight for that 2 seed consistently. You have to crawl before you can walk, and right now LCS teams are acting like we need to be sprinting to the finish line.